Have you ever felt as if your life was at a standstill, as if time was moving forward for everyone but you, while what you most expect just doesn't happen? There is a kind of silence that weighs more than any answer, an emptiness that grows when prayers don't seem to move, and days repeat themselves without any sign of change. And in the middle of it, a question begins to echo softly, almost like an uncomfortable whisper. Is God still looking at me, or have I been forgotten at some point along the way? It's strange how time can seem so slow when the heart is waiting for something that never comes. The hours drag on, the nights get longer, and the mind goes into a cycle that doesn't stop, trying to understand what went wrong, where it all went from its place. You remember the promises. You remember the words that once gave you strength, but now they seem distant, as if they belonged to another life. And the more you try to understand, the more confusing everything gets, as if there is something going on, but hidden out of his reach. But what if I told you that there is a detail that almost no one notices, something that has always been present, but that goes unnoticed by most people? A kind of silent key, hidden between the lines of the Bible's deepest teachings, something that explains exactly why time does not seem to cooperate, why certain answers take so long, and why some promises are only fulfilled after long periods of waiting. And the most intriguing thing is that this has nothing to do with effort, nor with merit, nor with luck. There is a pattern, an invisible movement, a specific way God works that, when understood, completely changes the way you see every delay, every silence, and every seeming delay. It is as if there were a spiritual code, simple in appearance but deep enough to completely transform the way you live and hope. Because the truth is that there is a way out of this anguish, but it is not where most people look. And when you understand this, something inside you begins to change, even before any answer appears. Today, you will come into contact with something that few people really apply, something that is not theory, but living experience. And if you stay until the end, there is a great chance that even today, within your heart, something will begin to align in a way that you have never felt before. On this path that we are starting now, you will notice something that may never have been explained in this way. Each part will reveal profound teachings from the Bible that show how God works behind the scenes, even when everything seems to stand still. Stories like Joseph, who was prepared in silence, David, who was molded in the wilderness, and even moments when Jesus was seemingly slow to act, will open your eyes to understand that there is a divine pattern happening right now in your life. In Isaiah 60:22 it is written, "The least shall become 1,000, and the least a mighty nation. I, the Lord, will do it promptly in due time." And as you continue here, something begins to move inside you. If this message is already speaking to your heart, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because this can reach someone who today is in need of exactly this word. This is where many people get lost, because they try to understand God's timing with human logic, and this will always generate frustration. The human mind has been trained to expect quick answers, immediate solutions, visible signs. But God does not work that way. His time is not guided by haste, it is guided by purpose. And when you try to fit God into your urgency, the result is almost always anxiety, doubt, and that feeling that something is wrong. But it is not. The problem is not the delay, it's the way you're interpreting that time. Look at the story of Lazarus. When Jesus received the news that he was sick, there was a natural expectation that he would immediately go there to heal him. It was logical, it was expected, it was what anyone would do, but what Jesus did completely breaks that logic. In John 11:6 it is written, "When he heard that he was sick, he remained 2 days in the place where he was." This seems strange at first glance. Why would someone who has the power to heal choose to wait? Why not act at the most convenient time? Because God's timing is not about expediency, it's about revelation. Jesus was not late, he was setting the stage for something greater. If he had gone earlier, there would have been a cure. But in waiting, he turned that situation into something no one could deny, a resurrection, something that surpasses any human explanation. And that's exactly how God acts many times in your life. He allows certain situations to reach the limit, not to destroy you, but so that when he acts, there is no doubt that it was his hand. What seems to take time, in fact, may be construction. What looks like silence can be alignment. There's something going on behind the scenes that you can't see, details being arranged, people being positioned, circumstances being adjusted. And as you try to speed up the process, God is working in the depth, where it really matters. Trusting this requires giving up control, and this is perhaps the hardest part, because control gives a false sense of security, but it also limits what God can do. When you understand that your vision is limited, but God's is complete, something begins to change within you. Anxiety loses strength because you realize that everything is not standing still. Despair begins to give way to a different expectation, a quiet hope that grows even without outward signs. You begin to understand that God's timing does not fail. It just follows a rhythm that you are still learning to trust. And maybe, right now, you are living one of those moments where everything seems to be taking too long, where the answers do not arrive and the mind tries to find explanations. But what if this timing is not a mistake? What if it is exactly the point where God is preparing something that could only happen in this way? If this message from God is speaking to you in a special way, maybe it's because today was the right day for you to hear it. Don't ignore this touch on your heart. If something inside you moved while you listened, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple word is the beginning of something you can't even imagine yet. And it is exactly at this point that something needs to be adjusted within you, because perhaps, without realizing it, you are more focused on the result than on the process. There is a silent haste in the human heart that wants to arrive quickly, that wants to see it happen, that wants to touch the promise without going through the road. But God does not work like that. To him, what you become during the process is more important than what you will receive in the end. Joseph's story makes this very clear, and you may already know parts of it, but there is a profound detail that many overlook. Joseph received a dream, a direct promise from God about his future. But what came next had nothing to do with what he expected. He was betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a grave, sold into slavery, wronged, imprisoned, and forgotten. At no time did it seem that God was fulfilling anything. On the contrary, everything gave the impression that the promise had been interrupted. But what seemed like a detour was actually the path. Each phase that Joseph lived was shaping something within him that would be essential later on. Pain taught endurance, injustice developed character, silence built maturity, and waiting formed discernment, because it would be no use for Joseph to arrive at the place of promise without being prepared to sustain it. In Genesis 50:20 it is written, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." This phrase is not just a conclusion of the story. It is the revelation that God never lost control at any point in the process. Now stop and think sincerely. What if God had already given you what you asked for so much today? Would you be ready to take care of it? Would you be prepared emotionally, spiritually, even mentally to sustain this promise without getting lost? Because many times what you call delay, God calls protection. He's not delaying, he's forming you. The problem is that the process almost always happens in silence. There is no recognition, no external confirmation, no clear signs. And that is exactly why many give up halfway, because they cannot see what is being built inside. But it is in this invisible place that God makes the most profound changes, the ones that will truly sustain what is to come. When you start to understand this, something changes in the way you see waiting. It ceases to be a burden and becomes a school. Each day becomes an opportunity for growth. Each difficulty takes on a new meaning, and even the most difficult moments begin to make sense. Because in the end, it's not just about arriving, it's about being ready when you arrive. And maybe that's the part God wants to work on in you right now. Not what you will receive, but who you need to become before you can receive. Because God's timing does not fail, but He also does not skip steps. If this word is awakening something deep within you, like a silent call to trust the process more, write in the comments, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears." And leave your like on this video because it helps this message reach other people who also need to understand what God is doing while everything seems to be at a standstill. Now a truth begins to emerge that completely changes the way you see silence. Because the fact that you're not seeing anything doesn't mean that nothing is happening. In fact, many of God's greatest works take place far from the eyes, in places where the human mind can't reach. There is an invisible, precise, detailed movement happening right now, while you may be thinking that everything is at a standstill. Esther's story reveals this in a striking way. At no initial moment did it seem that there was a clear plan. A young orphan, taken to a foreign palace in the midst of circumstances that seemed completely disconnected. Nothing there felt spiritual, nothing felt part of a higher purpose. But behind every detail, God was positioning pieces, organizing meetings, aligning decisions that at the right time would save an entire nation. In Esther 4:14 it is written, "And who knoweth whether thou hast come to this kingdom for such a time as this?" This phrase carries a profound weight because it reveals something that almost no one realizes in the middle of the wait. You can be exactly where you need to be, even without understanding why. The problem is that the invisible requires faith, because it is much easier to believe when there are signs, when there is movement, when something externally confirms what you expect. But when everything seems silent, the mind begins to doubt, the heart begins to restless, and that feeling arises that perhaps nothing is happening. But it is precisely at this point that trust in God's timing becomes real. Not when you see it, but when you choose to believe it even without seeing it. God is connecting things you don't imagine, people you don't know yet, situations that haven't happened yet, doors that will still open at the right moment. And while you try to understand the now, God is already working in the after. There is a preparation going on, a fine-tuning that only makes sense when the picture is complete. Before that, everything seems confusing, disconnected, even unfair at times. But God's invisible is more active than anything visible you can observe. Silence is not empty. It is loaded with intention. Every detail is being carefully aligned so that, at the right time, everything makes sense at once. And when that moment comes, you realize that nothing was by chance, nothing was lost, nothing was wasted. Maybe today you are in one of those moments where everything seems without explanation, where the pieces do not fit together and the path seems uncertain. But what if, like Esther, you are already in the right place at the right time without even realizing it? What if what seems ordinary today is exactly the scenario God is using for something much bigger? If this truth has touched you in any way, as a reminder that God continues to work even in silence, write in the comments, "God is in control." Sometimes declaring this doesn't change the scenario at the time, but it strengthens something inside you that sustains you until the right time comes. There is a point in the spiritual journey when waiting ceases to be just a time and becomes a mirror. Because it's not what you say you believe that defines your faith. It's how you react when nothing happens. It is in this silent place where there are no answers, where the signs do not appear, that true faith begins to be revealed. Not that faith that celebrates when everything goes right, but the one that stands firm when everything seems uncertain. Abraham lived just that. He received a promise that, humanly speaking, made no sense. Time passed, the years advanced, the body aged, and everything around pointed to the opposite of what God had said. Anyone looking from the outside would say that there was no longer any possibility. But Abraham's faith was not based on what he saw, it was based on who made the promise. In Romans 4:20-21, it is written, "And he did not doubt the promise of God through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully assured that what he had promised was also able to do it." Notice this carefully. He was strengthened in faith during the wait, not after. That changes everything, because it shows that God's timing does not weaken those who trust. It does. Each day without an answer was not a proof of abandonment. It was an opportunity to deepen trust. And that's exactly what's happening to you right now, even if you haven't realized it yet. Waiting becomes a test, but not in the sense of failure. God is not trying to bring you down. He is revealing what already exists within you. When all is well, it's easy to say that you trust. But when the scenario does not change, when the answer does not arrive, when time extends beyond what is expected, that is when faith truly manifests itself. And maybe that's why this moment that you're living in feels so intense, because it's not just about what you're waiting for, but who you're becoming as you wait. Faith is not believing only when there are signs, when everything fits, when there are external confirmations. Faith is standing firm when there is none of it. It's about continuing to trust when logic tells you to give up. It is to look at a promise that has not yet been fulfilled, and even so, choose to believe that it still stands. This kind of faith turns waiting into something sacred, like an invisible altar where you surrender your anxiety, your doubts, and your control, and decide to trust God above all else. And maybe, without realizing it, you're right at that altar right now. Every thought you face, every doubt you overcome, every time you decide not to give up, even tired, is building something powerful inside you. Because in God's time, it's not just the promise that matters, it's the faith that is born on the way to it. If you've made it this far, it's no accident. There is something being awakened within you, something that God wants to strengthen before releasing what you so much hope for. And at the end of this video, we're going to step into a time of deep prayer, a real encounter with God to renew your strength, calm your heart, and align your faith with His perfect timing. So stay with me until the end, because this moment can mark a change that you have been needing to live for a long time. There is a kind of silence that unsettles the soul, because it brings no explanations, offers no clear direction, and often seems to contradict everything you believed you heard from God. It is in this space, where the answers do not arrive, that many begin to doubt not only time, but the very presence of God. Because deep down, the question that echoes is simple and profound at the same time. If God is with me, why doesn't He answer? But God's silence is never empty. It carries intention, purpose, and depth. Job experienced this in a way that few can comprehend. In a short period of time, he lost everything: possessions, family, health, and stability. And the most disconcerting thing was not only the pain, but the silence. God did not explain, did not answer, did not justify. Yet in the midst of this scenario, Job declared something that reveals a rare level of spiritual understanding. In Job 23:10 it is written, "But He knows the way I go. If I have tested myself, I will come out like gold." Notice the depth of this. Job didn't understand what was happening, but he trusted that God knew. This completely changes the way of seeing silence. Because the problem was never the lack of response, but the difficulty of trusting without an answer. And it is exactly at this point that God's silence begins to act more intensely. He's not ignoring you. He's working in areas that words can't reach. Silence reveals intentions, because when there are no external responses, you begin to look within. It purifies motivations, because it takes away from you the dependence on signs and leads you to seek a deeper faith. It strengthens the spirit, because it teaches you to stay, even if you don't understand. And maybe that's why this moment you're living in seems so challenging, because God isn't just answering a request, He's transforming who you are. There is something being refined within you. Just as gold passes through fire to be purified, so does your faith. It's not comfortable, it's not easy, but it's necessary. Because God is not only interested in resolving situations, He wants to form a heart that trusts Him in any scenario. And this only happens when silence is no longer interpreted as abandonment and starts to be recognized as preparation. Maybe today you are in that very place, trying to understand why God has not spoken, why He has not answered, why everything seems so quiet. But what if that silence is the deepest way God works in you? What if, without even realizing it, you are being prepared for something that requires a stronger, more mature, firmer faith? Now, if that word has found something within you, like an answer you weren't expecting, state in the comments, "Lord, I receive your teachings." Write it as an act of delivery. And leave your like, because this message can reach someone who is also trying to understand God's silence and needs to find that peace. And even after all this, there is still a doubt that insists on appearing. What if it is past time? What if what you hoped for just won't happen anymore? Because when the limit arrives, when the strength begins to diminish and time seems to have exceeded any expectations, the feeling is that there has been a delay. But this is exactly where one of the most powerful truths needs to be understood. God is never late. The problem is that human beings measure time by the clock, but God works by alignment. He's not tied to human deadlines. He's connected to a perfect moment where everything falls into place with absolute precision. And when that moment comes, it is not partial, it is not incomplete, it is not improvised. It's full, it's definitive, it's exactly as it should be. The woman of the flow of blood experienced this intensely. There were years of suffering, of frustrated attempts, of physical and emotional exhaustion. The Bible shows that she had already done everything in her power, had already sought all possible solutions, but solved nothing. And as time went by, the natural tendency would be to give up, to accept that condition as permanent. But something inside her still believed, and then, in a moment that seemed ordinary, Jesus was passing by. In the middle of a crowd, surrounded by people, in a scenario that did not seem prepared for a specific miracle, this woman made a decision. She didn't wait to be called. She didn't wait for a perfect opportunity. She simply moved forward by faith and touched Jesus. And at that very moment, everything changed. In Mark 5:34 it is written, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." It wasn't before, it wasn't after, it was at that precise moment. This reveals something profound. There was no delay, there was alignment. Each year of pain, each failed attempt, each difficult moment was not a waste. It was part of a process that culminated in that exact encounter. Because God's timing doesn't miss the point. He works by connecting faith, purpose, and moment seamlessly. Perhaps, looking at your life today, it seems that something should have happened by now. You may feel like you've waited too long, that too much time has passed, that you've reached the limit. But what if what you are experiencing now is not the end but the point of alignment? What if everything that has happened so far is positioning you for exactly the right moment? God does not anticipate, but neither does He waste time. He acts at the exact moment where everything makes sense, even if before that it seems confusing. And when He does, He leaves no doubts. He leaves no gaps. He does not leave incomplete. If this message is already touching something inside you, understand that it is no coincidence. God speaks in ways that we often don't realize, but when the heart recognizes it, it's because something is moving. And now you can be a part of it in a simple but powerful way. When you like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, this message reaches other people who are also waiting, doubting, and needing to understand God's timing. Do it now and help take that word further. There is a silent battle that takes place within the waiter, and perhaps you have already felt it. On the one hand, the willingness to trust, to believe that God is in control. On the other, a constant impulse to try to solve, to anticipate, to force situations so that something finally happens. And this internal tension tires, wears out, steals peace. Because deep down, the biggest challenge is not waiting. It's letting go of the controller while you wait. Trusting in God's timing requires something that is not always easy to admit: surrender. Not a superficial surrender of words, but a real surrender, where you give up trying to lead everything and allow God to take complete control. And this deeply touches the human heart, because we have been used to acting, to deciding, to trying to guarantee results. But in the kingdom of God, often advancement begins when you stop fighting the process. Jesus showed this clearly in one of the most intense moments of his entire journey. In Gethsemane, just before facing the cross, he expressed something profoundly human. There was pain, there was anguish, there was the weight of what was to come. And at that moment, he could have retreated, he could have resisted, he could have chosen another path. But instead, he offered a prayer that reveals the highest level of trust. In Matthew 26:39, it is written, "Not as I will, but as you will." This phrase is not just an example. It is an invitation, because it shows that true peace does not come when everything is resolved, but when the heart decides to trust, even without fully understanding. As long as there is resistance, there will be conflict. As long as you try to control time, there will be anxiety. But when you surrender, something starts to change inside you. Surrender is not giving up, it is aligning. It is not abandoning your dreams. It is trusting that God knows the best way and the best time to make them come true. It is to stop fighting against time and start walking with it. And when that happens, a different peace begins to emerge, not because circumstances have changed, but because your inner self has been adjusted. Perhaps what is preventing you from resting is not the delay, but the weight of trying to control something that was never in your hands. What if today you simply decided to deliver, not as a symbolic gesture, but as an actual decision to trust that God is leading everything, even when you don't see it? Because it is in this place of surrender that God's timing begins to make real sense. Not as something you need to understand, but as something you learn to trust. And if this message has led you to think of someone who is also struggling with this weight, someone who needs to learn to trust and deliver, write that person's name in the comments. It could be someone in your family, a friend, or even someone who has come to your heart right now. By doing this, you join a current of faith, placing that person before God, along with everyone who is here, believing that something can begin to change from that moment on. And when you begin to see all of this more clearly, something even deeper reveals itself. God's timing isn't just leading you to a promise, it's turning you into someone who can keep it. Because receiving something without being prepared can be as dangerous as never receiving it. And that is why waiting, as difficult as it may seem, carries a value that many only understand after they go through it. David is a living example of this truth. He was anointed king at a young age. He received a clear, direct, powerful promise. But what came next was not an immediate path to the throne. On the contrary, there were years of persecution, rejection, isolation, and constant challenges. In many moments, it seemed that the promise was too distant, almost forgotten. But in reality, each of these phases was building something inside him. As he fled, David learned to depend on God. While facing difficulties, his character was strengthened. As he dealt with injustices, his emotional maturity was formed. Because it was not enough just to be chosen, he needed to be prepared. In Psalm 27:14 it is written, "Wait on the Lord, take courage, and he will strengthen your heart." This is not just an orientation, it is a revelation. Strengthening happens in waiting. And maybe that's the part that completely changes the way you see what you're living now. Because the real miracle is not just what you will receive, but who you are becoming until you get there. Waiting is developing in you something that would not be possible otherwise. Resilience, not to give up easily. Wisdom, to make the right decisions. Balance so you don't get lost when things change. And above all, a faith that does not depend on circumstances. The problem is that, in the middle of the process, this is not always visible. You feel the weight, you face the challenges, you deal with the doubts, but you don't immediately realize what's being built inside of you. But over time, this begins to appear. Your thinking changes, your reaction to difficulties changes, your trust in God becomes firmer, and when the promise finally arrives, you're no longer the same person you started waiting. Perhaps, if everything had happened too quickly, you would not be ready to live what you asked for so much. Maybe some doors haven't opened yet because God is strengthening something inside you first. And this is not delay, it is care. It is God guaranteeing that when it comes, it will be complete. It will be stable, it will be lasting. And if you look sincerely inside yourself now, you will realize that you have already changed more than you imagine. Things that once shook you don't have the same effect anymore. Thoughts that once dominated you are no longer as strong. This is a sign that the process is working even if you are still waiting. None of this is in vain. Each day, each phase, each moment is contributing to something greater that is being formed in you. Nothing happens by chance. If you have come this far, it is because there is something that God wants to strengthen within you before releasing what you are waiting for. Stay until the end, because there is still something very important that you need to understand, something that can change the way you face time, waiting, and the very presence of God in your life. And when this maturity begins to form within you, something subtle but extremely powerful also begins to happen. Your relationship with time changes. Before, each day seemed heavy, each delay seemed a sign that something was wrong. But now, albeit silently, you begin to realize that there is a growth happening that does not depend on immediate results. David did not become strong when he sat on the throne. He became strong when he was still hidden, when no one saw, when everything seemed uncertain. It was in anonymity, in the caves, in the moments when he could have given up, that his faith was consolidated. And this reveals a detail that often goes unnoticed. God does not prepare you after the promise, He prepares you before. There is a huge difference between receiving something and being ready to keep it. Many want to live promises, but few are willing to go through the process that sustains those promises, because the process requires patience, it requires trust, it requires continuing even when there is no recognition. And this is exactly what makes waiting sacred. In Psalm 27:14 it is written, "Wait on the Lord, take courage, and He will strengthen your heart." Realize that it is not just waiting, it is allowing that during that waiting, something within you is strengthened. This means that God's time is never empty, it is always filled with growth, with learning, with transformation. And maybe you haven't realized it, but the person you are today is no longer the same as some time ago. The way you deal with difficulties has changed. The way you see problems is different. Even his spiritual sensitivity was enlarged. This did not happen by chance. This was built in the waiting time. What once made you desperate, today you can face more calmly. What used to take away his peace, today no longer has the same power. This is maturity being formed. This is God working in areas that no one sees, but that make all the difference when the time is right. Because when the promise is fulfilled, it will not only be about what you have received, but about who you have become along the way. And that's the safest part of the process. Because what God builds within you cannot be taken away, cannot be shaken easily, does not depend on external circumstances. Perhaps if you had received everything before, you would not have valued it in the same way. You would not have sustained it with balance. You would not have recognized God's care in every detail. But now, after all that you have experienced, there is a solid foundation being built. And that's exactly what makes God's timing perfect. Not only because He delivers, but because He prepares. Not only because He fulfills, but because He forms. And as you keep walking, even without seeing everything clearly, something inside you is getting stronger, firmer, more prepared for what is to come. And as this inner strength begins to consolidate, a realization emerges that once seemed distant. Trusting in God's timing is not just enduring waiting, it is learning to live with purpose within it. Because there is a very big difference between waiting while suffering and waiting growing. And it is exactly at this point that many have not yet realized what God is doing. While you think you're just waiting for something to happen, God is working in deeper dimensions than what you've asked for. He is adjusting thoughts, aligning emotions, strengthening decisions, and above all, teaching you to walk with Him in a more intimate way. Because the greatest secret of God's timing is not just in what He delivers, but in how He reveals Himself during the process. There is a closeness that is only born in waiting. When everything is resolved, it is easy to follow, it is easy to be grateful, it is easy to recognize. But when there are no answers, when the path seems uncertain, when time stretches beyond what you expect, you begin to seek God in a truer, deeper, more constant way. And that changes everything. Perhaps without realizing it, you are already praying differently, already be reflecting more, seeking more understanding, having more sensitivity to perceive small things that previously went unnoticed. This is no coincidence. This is the result of a relationship that is being built in silence. And that's why trusting in God's timing goes far beyond waiting for something external. It's about allowing this time to transform your way of thinking, your way of feeling, and even your way of relating to Him. Because when this transformation happens, you no longer depend only on answers to have peace. You begin to find rest in the process itself. And that doesn't mean that the wait is no longer challenging. There are still difficult days, there are still moments of doubt, there are still unanswered questions, but now there's something different sustaining you inside. A firmer trust, a more conscious faith, a peace that begins to appear even before any external change. And maybe that's the key you've been missing for you to understand everything so far. It's not about how long it's going to take, but about what's being built as time goes on. Because when God decides to act, He doesn't just solve situations. He reveals that the whole path was part of something much bigger. And if you look closely, you'll realize that even without clear answers, you're not standing still. There is growth, there is movement, there is something being prepared that is not yet visible, but is already underway. And this completely changes the way you face each day. That word didn't come to you by chance. There is something being lined up now, something that you may not be able to explain yet, but you can feel. And if this touched your soul in any way, write in the comments, "I trust God." Sometimes a simple statement is the missing step to strengthen what is beginning to be born within you. And as this realization deepens, you begin to notice something that previously went unnoticed. God is not only interested in taking you to a destination, He is teaching you to walk with Him at any stage of life, because there is a silent risk in receiving something without having developed a solid spiritual foundation. And that is exactly what God's timing avoids. Many people ask for external changes, but God begins with the internal. As you look at whatever happens around you, He is looking at what needs to be adjusted within you. And this is not rejection, it is care. Because what is not dealt with in the process can compromise what will be experienced in the future. Jesus, at various times, taught that the kingdom of God begins within. In Luke 17:21 it is written, "For the kingdom of God is within you." This reveals that before any external manifestation, there is an internal work going on. And this work is often only possible in the time of waiting, where distractions diminish and the heart becomes more sensitive. Maybe that's why some things haven't happened yet. Not because God has forgotten, but because He is prioritizing something deeper. He is strengthening your roots, adjusting your vision, teaching you to stand firm, regardless of the circumstances. Because when this foundation is solid, nothing shakes easily. And there is an important detail that few realize. When you learn to trust in God's timing, you stop living hostage to anxiety. You no longer need immediate answers to have peace. You no longer rely on constant signals to keep going. There is a security that is born within you, a quiet conviction that God is in control even when everything seems uncertain. This does not mean that you no longer have doubts, but it does mean that doubts no longer have the same power. They don't dominate your mind as they once did, because now there is something greater sustaining you. A faith that has been built, not just declared. A confidence that has been tested, not just desired. And as you continue on this path, something begins to align naturally. Your decisions become more conscious, your attitudes more balanced, your way of reacting to difficulties more firm. This is a reflection of a real transformation, which does not depend on external circumstances, but on an internal work that God is carrying out with precision. Maybe you're still waiting for answers. Maybe there are still areas of your life that seem to be at a standstill, but at the same time, something inside you is no longer the same. There is more calm, more understanding, more spiritual sensitivity. And that's a clear sign that God isn't absent. He's acting in a way that goes beyond what you can see. If you're here so far, it's no accident. There is something being awakened within you, something that God wants to strengthen before He takes you to the next level. And in the next few moments, you will understand even more deeply how all of this connects with what you are experiencing today. So stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can completely change the way you see God's timing in your life. And the more you walk in this understanding, the more you realize that God's timing is not just about waiting for something to happen, but about learning to recognize His movements while everything still feels the same. Because there is a detail that completely transforms this journey. God is not just preparing what you asked for, He's positioning you to live something you can't even imagine yet. There are times when you look at your reality and think that nothing has changed, that everything is still in the same place. But if you look more sensitively, you'll notice small changes happening. Doors that closed and at the time seemed like losses, but today they make sense. Paths that did not work, but avoided greater pain. People who have moved away, making room for a new cycle that is still being formed. This is no coincidence. This is direction. In Proverbs 16:9, it is written, "A man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps." This reveals something profound. Not everything you have planned will happen the way you imagined, but everything God allows has a purpose aligned with something bigger. And trusting in His timing also means trusting in detours, pauses, and even new beginnings. Because sometimes God doesn't answer the way you expect, precisely because He's leading you to something better. But in the middle of the process, this is not always clear, and that's where trust needs to be stronger than the need to understand. Maybe you are living in a moment where some plans have not come to fruition, where some expectations have not been met, and this has generated doubts. But what if these no's were in fact protection? What if what didn't happen freed you from something you can't see yet? God's timing is also revealed in the interruptions. Not everything that stops is delay. Sometimes it is redirection. Not everything that closes is loss. Sometimes it is deliverance. And when you start to see it that way, the heart starts to rest, because you understand that God not only controls time, but also paths. And even when you don't see it clearly, He's adjusting everything precisely. Every detail, every meeting, every decision, everything is being aligned so that, at the right time, you are exactly where you need to be. This requires trust, a trust that does not depend on complete explanations, but on an inner certainty that God knows what He is doing. And this certainty is not born overnight. It is built along the way, in each moment where you choose to continue, even without understanding everything. Perhaps you are now beginning to realize that, despite the uncertainties, God has taken care of you in ways that you did not notice before. And just by recognizing this, something already changes inside you. God has been good, even in the details that have gone unnoticed. And if you feel this in your heart, as a silent confirmation of everything that is being said here, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple word expresses a faith that is growing inside you without you fully realizing it yet. And there is an even deeper layer to this process that few can perceive while they are living. God not only directs your steps, He is also developing in you the ability to discern the right path at the right time. Because trusting in God's timing isn't just about waiting patiently, it's about learning to recognize when He's moving. Often, the answer you expect so much does not come in an obvious way. It does not arrive with clear warnings, nor with grandiose signs. Sometimes it comes as an unexpected peace in the midst of chaos. Other times, it is a discomfort that prevents you from following a path that seemed right. And this is where something essential comes in: spiritual discernment. In Hebrews 5:14 it is written, "But solid meat is for the perfect, who by reason of custom have their senses trained to discern both good and evil." This means that there is a training going on inside you. Each phase of waiting is fine-tuning your spiritual sensitivity, teaching you to notice what previously went unnoticed. Perhaps in the past you made decisions based only on logic, haste, or emotion. But now, something has changed. There is a pause before acting, a deeper reflection, a search for direction. This is not weakness, this is spiritual maturity being formed. God is teaching you not only to live in His time, but to walk consciously within that time. And this completely changes the way you face situations, because instead of acting impulsively, you start waiting for the right moment. Instead of dwelling on something that doesn't flow, you start to realize when it's time to back off. Instead of despairing for quick answers, you learn to value the quiet direction that comes from God. This kind of sensitivity is not born out of nowhere. It is the result of waiting, moments when you didn't have clear answers, but decided to keep searching. And now, even without fully realizing it, you are no longer led only by what you see, but also by what you feel in the spirit. Maybe you're still waiting for something specific, an answer, a change, a promise to be fulfilled. But at the same time, God is already giving you tools that go far beyond that. He is teaching you to live in an aligned way, to make firmer decisions, to walk more safely, even in the midst of uncertainties. And this is one of the greatest proofs that God's timing is active in your life. Because when He begins to change your way of thinking, your way of feeling, and your way of deciding, it means that something much bigger is being prepared. This word is not for everyone. If you are here now, it is because there is something specific that God wants to show you, something that can change the way you see everything you are experiencing. Then keep going until the end, because what's yet to come can open your eyes in a way you didn't imagine. And the more you advance in this understanding, the more you realize that trusting in God's timing also involves recognizing that not every open door comes from Him, and not every closed door is a hindrance. There is a spiritual wisdom being built within you that begins to better filter what once seemed like opportunity, but could actually take you away from the purpose. Jesus taught this in a subtle but profound way when He spoke about the narrow way. In Matthew 7:14, it is written, "And because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way that leads to life, and there are few who find it." This shows that the easiest, fastest, or most accessible path is not always the right path. And trusting in God's timing is also having the courage not to move forward when He does not give direction. This directly confronts the haste that exists within us. Because many times we want any answer, any sign of movement, any change that takes us out of the feeling of waiting. But God doesn't work to relieve momentary anxiety. He works to fulfill eternal purpose. And this requires precision. Maybe you've experienced moments when something seemed perfect. It seemed like the answer you've been waiting for, but for some reason it didn't happen. At the time, this generated frustration, doubt, even questions. But today, looking back, you may be able to see that it was deliverance, which, if it had worked, could have led you to a path that was not ideal. This is how God often works. He not only leads by the yeses, but also by the no's. And these no's, although difficult to accept at the moment, carry a protection that will only be understood with time. Because God's timing not only reveals what He does, but also what He avoids. And as this awareness grows within you, a new posture begins to emerge. You no longer feel as much of a need to force situations. He no longer tries to open doors in his own effort. There is a different calm, a more solid confidence that what comes from God flows at the right time, without needing manipulation, without needing despair. This does not mean passivity, but alignment. It means walking attentively, sensitively, willing to move forward when God directs, but also willing to stop when He does not confirm. And this balance is something that only time and experience with God can build. Because in the end, trusting in God's timing is also trusting in the paths He chooses, even when they seem longer, more difficult, or less understandable. There is a security in this, a certainty that even if you do not understand all the details, God continues to lead everything perfectly. And as long as you keep walking, even with doubts, even without all the answers, something inside you is no longer the same. There is more discernment, more care, more spiritual awareness. And this shows that God's time is not just passing. He is transforming you into someone who knows how to recognize, choose, and stay on the right path. And at this point in the journey, a truth begins to take hold more clearly within you. Trusting in God's timing is not only accepting what He does, but also resting in the way He conducts every detail. Because there's a profound difference between believing that God can do something and trusting that He is doing it, even when you don't realize it. Anxiety is often born from trying to anticipate what only God can reveal at the right time. The mind tries to predict, calculate, imagine scenarios as if that could bring some kind of security. But in practice, this only increases the burden of waiting. Because the more you try to understand everything ahead of time, the farther you get from the peace God wants to give you now. Jesus taught something essential about this when He said at Matthew 6:34, "Do not be anxious about tomorrow, because tomorrow will take care of itself." This is not just advice, it is spiritual direction. It means that there is enough grace for today, enough direction for today, enough sustenance for today. Tomorrow has not yet come, but God is already there. And when you start living with that awareness, something changes within you. The need to have all the answers decreases. The urgency to control every detail loses strength. and a simpler, lighter confidence begins to take place. It is not a trust based on explanations, but on relationship. Because in the end, trusting in God's timing is trusting in who He is. It's believing that He is faithful even when the scenario doesn't show it clearly. It is resting in the certainty that He sees what you do not see, understands what you do not understand, and prepares what you do not even imagine. Maybe you're still struggling with thoughts that keep coming back, doubts that don't seem to go away completely. But now you already have something different inside you. A foundation that is being built, a faith that is being strengthened, a perception that begins to see beyond the immediate. And it changes the way you live each day. Because, even without complete answers, you no longer feel lost as before. There is a quiet direction, a security that does not depend on perfect circumstances, but on the constant presence of God in your life. And as you keep walking like this, step by step, something starts to align in a natural way. Situations begin to make sense, connections begin to emerge, decisions become clearer, not because you forced it, but because the time was right. And that's exactly what God does. He doesn't just respond, He fits everything together in a way that goes beyond what you could possibly plan. Now think for a moment, how many people just like you are trying to understand God's timing and need a word like that? Sometimes a simple gesture can get that message to someone who needs it today. If this message made sense to you, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. In this way you become part of something bigger, helping that word reach other hearts that are also waiting for direction, comfort, and an answer from God. And there is an even deeper point within all of this that few can see while they are living the process. God's timing is not just taking you to a place, He is teaching you to trust Him above any result. Because deep down, the greatest transformation is not external, it is internal. It's not about what happens around you, but about what settles inside you. Many people can only rest when everything is resolved, when the answers arrive, when the promises are fulfilled. But God wants to bring you to a level where your peace doesn't depend on it, where you can stand your ground even when there are still unanswered questions. And this is not something that happens automatically, it is something that time builds. In Isaiah 26:3 it is written, "You will keep him in peace, whose mind is set on you, for he trusteth in thee." This reveals that peace does not come from circumstances, but from the position of the heart. When the mind is fixed on God, when trust is aligned with Him, something changes. The scenery may not have changed yet, but the interior is already starting to find rest. Perhaps for a long time you have associated peace with answer, as if it were only possible to rest after everything was resolved. But God's timing teaches you something different. He shows you that it is possible to have peace before the answer comes, that it is possible to trust before understanding, that it is possible to rest even in the midst of uncertainty, and it completely changes the way you live. Because now you're no longer tied to the need for control. You no longer need everything to make sense right away. There is a security that goes beyond logic, a confidence that does not depend on complete explanations. And as this strengthens within you, even the way you face time changes. He ceases to be an enemy and becomes an ally. Because you understand that each phase has a purpose, each moment carries a lesson, each wait is producing something that goes far beyond what you can see now. Perhaps there are still areas of your life that seem undefined, situations that have not yet been resolved, paths that are not yet clear. But at the same time, something inside you no longer reacts as it used to. There is more calm, more stability, more confidence. And that's a clear sign that God is at work. Because when He begins to establish peace within you, before He even changes what is outside, it means that He is building something solid, something that will not be shaken easily. And it is in this place that trust becomes real, not just as an idea, but as a lived experience. A quiet assurance that regardless of the weather, God remains in control, guiding every detail to perfection, even when you still can't see the full picture. And when that peace begins to settle within you, an even deeper realization emerges that completely transforms the way you look at life. God doesn't just control time, He sustains you within it. Because it's one thing to wait when everything is fine, it's quite another to stand firm when the landscape remains challenging. It is at this point that many become discouraged, not because they have lost faith altogether, but because they have grown tired of waiting without seeing change. But there is one essential detail that needs to be understood. God never asks you to carry the weight of the process alone. In Matthew 11:28 it is written, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." This shows that in the midst of waiting, there is a constant invitation to rest. Not a rest based on responses, but a rest based on presence. Maybe you're tired, not just physically but emotionally, tired of trying to understand, of fighting thoughts, of maintaining hope even when everything seems the same. And it is exactly in this place that God approaches most intensely, not to demand more strength from you, but to sustain you with His strength, because trusting in God's timing doesn't mean never feeling weak. It means knowing where to find strength when weakness appears. It means recognizing that there are difficult days, but also understanding that you don't have to face them alone. There is a constant, silent, but real presence sustaining you even when you don't realize it. And when you start living that, something changes in the way you face each day. The pressure decreases. The weight becomes lighter, not because situations changed immediately, but because you are no longer trying to carry everything yourself. There is a deeper surrender, a more real dependence. And maybe that's exactly what God is trying to teach you right now. Not just waiting, but resting while waiting. Not just believing that He will do it, but trusting that He is already taking care of every detail. Because when this trust is established, the heart finds a kind of peace that cannot be explained, only lived. And even as time continues to move forward with no visible answers, something inside you remains steadfast. Not because you have all the explanations, but because you know who you're trusting. And that makes all the difference. Maybe today you are still in the middle of the process, still dealing with uncertainties, still waiting for something that seems to take time. But at the same time, God is already sustaining you in a way that you may not realize fully until later. If this message is bringing silent confirmation to your heart, as a reminder that God has not abandoned you at any time, write in the comments, "God takes care of me." Because sometimes declaring this is what strengthens the faith to keep walking, even when everything is still under construction. And as you continue to walk at this level of understanding, something even deeper begins to unfold. God is not only sustaining you in time, He is teaching you to trust even when everything around you seems unstable. Because there's a difference between having faith when everything is under control and keeping faith when nothing seems to make sense. It is at this point that trust ceases to be a comfortable choice and becomes a conscious decision, not based on what you see, but on what you believe. And that decision is what sustains you on days when your heart wavers, on the moments when your mind tries to return to anxiety, on those moments when everything seems too quiet. The Bible shows this very clearly in Peter's life. There was a moment when he walked on water, something completely out of human logic. As long as his eyes were on Jesus, he stood firm. But when he started looking at the wind, the waves, the scenery around him, he started to sink. In Matthew 14:30 it is written, "But when he felt the strong wind, he was afraid. And when he began to go to the bottom, he cried out, saying, 'Lord, save me.'" This passage reveals something powerful. The problem was not the water nor the wind, it was the focus. And this connects directly with God's timing, because you often start out trusting, but as you wait, you start looking too much at the circumstances. For what hasn't changed, for what hasn't happened, for what seems to be out of place. And little by little, this weakens his peace. But when you realign the gaze, something changes immediately. Not because the scenario has changed, but because his confidence has returned to the right place. And that's exactly what God is teaching you right now. Not to base your faith on what's going on around you, but on the assurance that he remains in control, even when everything seems unstable. Maybe you're facing moments when negative thoughts try to gain space, where doubts arise unexpectedly, where the weight starts to weigh more than before, but that doesn't mean you're going backwards. Often this is part of the strengthening process. Because each time you choose to trust again, even after questioning, your faith becomes more resilient. And little by little, you realize that it is no longer about having all the answers, but about staying connected with God in any scenario. There is a stability being built within you that is no longer dependent on external conditions, a faith that is not easily shaken, a confidence that remains even when time extends. And this is rare, because most people give up when they don't see quick results. But those who remain, those who continue to trust even without understanding everything, are the ones who experience something deeper. Not just answers, but real transformation. And maybe that's exactly what's happening to you right now. Something is being strengthened, adjusted, aligned in a way that you can't fully see yet, but you can already feel. What you will notice next may be exactly the missing piece for you to understand all this at once. But few can see this detail at the right time. Continue until the end, because what comes now can completely change the way you see God's action in your life. And it is exactly at this point in the journey that something begins to change in a quieter way, but more profound than any visible answer. You begin to perceive God's voice in a different way, not as something distant, not as something confusing, but as a presence that speaks subtly, constantly, and often unexpectedly, because there is a very big difference between hearing about God and recognizing when He is the one who is speaking to you. And this difference is not learned in haste, it does not develop in noise, it does not happen when everything is resolved. It is born exactly in the time of waiting, where silence begins to become an environment of spiritual sensitivity. Samuel lived this in a remarkable way. As a young man, he heard a voice, but he didn't know where it came from. He did not yet have the discernment to recognize that he was God. It took a few tries, a few moments of confusion, before he learned to answer the right way. And when he finally understood, his posture changed completely. In 1 Samuel 3:10 it is written, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." This phrase reveals something powerful. Hearing God's voice doesn't start with God speaking louder, it starts with you learning to listen better. And maybe that's exactly what's happening to you right now, without even fully realizing it. That time that you called silence, that period where it seems that God has not answered, may actually be the environment where He is teaching you to recognize His voice in a clearer way. Because when everything is very hectic, when there are many distractions, many quick answers, many external voices, it becomes difficult to discern what really comes from God. But when time slows down, when the answers don't come right away, when the silence lingers, something starts to adjust within you. You begin to notice details that you previously ignored, a direction that arises in the heart, a peace that appears without explanation, a nuisance that prevents you from following certain paths. This is not random. That's God training your perception. And this training does not happen overnight. It's a relationship that's being built. Every moment of waiting becomes an opportunity to deepen that connection. Each silence becomes an invitation to listen more carefully. Perhaps at first you were frustrated by not hearing clear answers. Perhaps you thought God was not speaking. But now, Little by little, you begin to realize that he has always been speaking, just in a way that you were still learning to recognize. And that completely changes the waiting experience. Because it is no longer just a time of absence of answers and becomes a time of discovery, a time where you learn to walk, not only looking for answers, but looking for presence. And the more you develop that sensitivity, the more natural it becomes to realize when God is directing, when he is confirming, when he is leading you, even without audible words. And this is how trust in God's timing is strengthened even more, because you no longer depend only on visible results. You begin to recognize his voice on the way, in the process, in the silence. And that creates a security that can't be shaken easily, because now you don't just believe in God, you begin to hear him. And when you begin to perceive this voice of God more clearly, something even more profound unfolds. He doesn't just speak to you, he's also preparing you for something you may not even be able to see yet. Because every call of God begins long before it becomes visible, long before any recognition, long before any outward result. There is a hidden, silent time where God works away from people's eyes, but deep within you. And it is exactly at this time that many are confused, because it seems that nothing is happening, when in fact everything is being built. Moses is one of the strongest examples of this. Before he became the deliverer of Israel, before he faced Pharaoh, before he experienced extraordinary miracles, he spent years in the desert, away from the stage, away from any highlight, living a simple routine, taking care of sheep. And looking from the outside, it seemed that his life had lost its purpose. But in reality, this was the place where God was shaping his identity. It was in the wilderness that Moses learned to depend on God, that his impulsiveness was dealt with, that his strength ceased to be human and began to become spiritual. And only after this process, at the right time, God appeared and said in Exodus 3:10, "Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh." Notice this carefully. The call already existed, but the sending only happened after the preparation, and this connects directly with what you are experiencing, because maybe you have within you dreams, promises, something that you feel God has put in your heart, but at the same time, there is a wait, a time where nothing seems to advance the way you imagined. And this can generate doubt, it can even generate frustration. But what if this time is not a delay? What if it is exactly the period where God is preparing you to sustain what he will put in your hands? Because the call doesn't start when people see it, it starts when God decides to work within you. And this work requires time. It requires processes. It requires situations that you often don't understand at the time, but that make all the difference later. Maybe you're in a desert right now, a place where everything seems too simple, too still, too quiet. But this may be the very environment where God is building the foundations you'll need in the future. And when you start to see it that way, the weight changes meaning. It is no longer a burden and becomes a training. Each day becomes a preparation, each challenge a class, each silence a building tool, because God does not surrender responsibilities without first forming structure. He does not expound before preparing. It does not speed up processes that need to be completed. And perhaps, without realizing it, you are already being molded, adjusted, strengthened for something that has not yet manifested, but that has already begun within you a long time ago. Before moving on, if there is something inside your heart that you feel needs direction, response, or intervention from God, write your prayer request in the comments. Put into words what you have been carrying, because when you do it in faith, you connect with something bigger, and together, in prayer, many things can begin to move, even if still invisibly. And it is precisely here that many end up getting confused, Because when learning about waiting in God's time, some come to believe that this means only standing still, without acting, without moving. But there is a truth that needs to be clearly understood. Trusting in God's timing is not living in inertia. It is developing sensitivity to act exactly when He directs. Because the same God who asks for patience at times also demands readiness at others. There is a quiet time, but there is also an immediate response time. And discerning this difference is one of the most profound keys to the spiritual life. Jonah's story reveals this directly. God did not speak in a confused manner, nor did He leave room for doubt. The instruction was clear, objective, and urgent. In Jonah 1:2 it is written, "Get up, go to the great city of Nineveh." There was no room for negotiation, nor for postponement. It was a time to act. But Jonas did what we often do. He did not deny that God spoke, but tried to run away from what he heard. Not because he didn't understand, but because he didn't want to obey at that time. And that's one of the subtlest pitfalls, recognizing God's voice but resisting His timing. And every time there is resistance, consequences arise. Jonah faced storms, confusion, fear, until he was taken to an extreme point where there was no way to escape. And only then did he decide to line up. This shows that it is not enough to know what God wants. It is necessary to respond at the right time, because there is a difference between waiting for direction and postponing obedience. Waiting is when God has not yet spoken. Postpone is when He has already spoken, but you hesitate. Perhaps until now you have lived a time of waiting, of silence, of preparation, and that was necessary. But it may be that now, in some area of your life, God has already given a sign, a direction, something clear within your heart. And even so, there is a doubt, a hesitation, a fear of taking the next step. And it is exactly at this point that trust in God's timing needs to manifest itself in another way. No longer just waiting, but obeying. Because when God releases direction, time changes. It is no longer a time to wait, it is a time to act. And the longer you put it off, the more discomfort arises, the more confusion appears, because you are out of the rhythm that God has established. But when you line up, even with fear, even without having all the guarantees, something starts to adjust immediately. The path opens, the direction becomes clearer, and you realize that God not only called you, but was already ready to sustain each step. And this reveals an essential balance, knowing how to wait when God asks for silence, and knowing how to act when He releases the word. Because trusting in God's timing is also having the courage to get up at the right time, without hesitating, without running away, without postponing what He has already made clear within you. And maybe right now there is something that God has already shown you, something that you have been putting off, something that you know you need to do, but have not yet had the courage to take the first step. And this may be the time to realize that the time to wait has passed, and the time to move began. And when you start taking these steps of obedience, even if there are still doubts, something deeper begins to happen, something that goes beyond external circumstances. Because God's timing isn't just arranging situations around you, He's working directly on your identity. He is transforming who you are, and this transformation does not always happen comfortably. It often comes through failures, mistakes, moments when you realize your own limitations. And this can be difficult to accept because no one likes to acknowledge that they still need to change. But this is exactly where God begins to act more deeply. Peter is a clear example of this. He walked with Jesus, saw miracles, heard direct teachings, but even so he was impulsive, spoke without thinking, acted out of emotion. At one point he declared absolute fidelity. He said he would never deny Jesus. But when he was confronted, he failed. He denied, was shaken, lost at that moment. And it could seem like the end of his story, but in fact it was the beginning of a much larger transformation. Because God didn't discard Peter because of the failure. He used that moment to mold something new within him. In Luke 22:32 it is written, "And you, when you are converted, strengthen your brothers." That is, before strengthening others, Peter needed to be transformed from within. And this reveals something essential about God's timing. He does not ignore his falls. He uses each one of them as part of the building process. That which you see as error, God sees as material for transformation. What you call weakness, God uses to develop spiritual strength. Perhaps you have experienced moments when you failed, moments when you thought you had missed opportunities, that you were not up to what God wanted to do. But what if these moments were not the end, but part of the process? Because God is not only interested in taking you to a destination, He wants you to get there by being someone different, someone stronger, more aware, more prepared. And this only happens when there is internal transformation. And this transformation happens gradually, not instantaneously, but over time. Each experience, each difficulty, each new beginning shapes your way of thinking, your way of acting, your way of reacting. You begin to realize that you no longer make decisions as before. You no longer react in the same way. You no longer get carried away by emotions so easily. There is something new being formed within you, a firmness that did not exist before. And this is proof that God's timing is active in your life. Because while you wait for external changes, He is making the greatest change of all, within you. Maybe you're still in the middle of this process, still dealing with adjustments, still facing situations that reveal areas that need to be transformed. But that's not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that God is working deeply in you. You are no longer the same person as before, even if you have not yet reached where you want to be. There is a new identity being built, and when the right time comes, you will be ready not only to receive, but to live differently. And if this truth touched something inside you, as an acknowledgement that God is shaping you even in the most difficult phases, write in the comments, "God chose me." Because understanding this completely changes the way you see your own process. And it is at this point that something even more challenging comes into play, something that separates an ordinary faith from an unshakable faith. The ability to remain even when God seems silent. Because while some give up in the face of delay, others discover that it is precisely at this time that faith becomes stronger, firmer, deeper. The Canaanite woman lived exactly this type of experience. She had an urgent request, something that couldn't wait, something that hurt deeply. She came to Jesus with a clear expectation of a response, of intervention, of a miracle. But what she found first was not an immediate answer. It was silence. And this is the point where many stop. Because when God doesn't respond on time, the natural tendency is to think that He won't be answered, that it's not the time, or even that He's not listening. But that woman did something different. She remained. Even without an answer, even without immediate recognition, she continued. And when there was finally an answer, it wasn't easy to accept. It was an even deeper test. But instead of retreating, she moved forward with humility, with persistence, with a faith that did not depend on the way she was being treated at that moment. It was not based on silence nor on difficulty. It was based on the certainty of who Jesus was. And that's why, in Matthew 15:28, Jesus declares, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be done to you as you desire." Notice that the miracle was not just the result of the request, but of perseverance. It was the insistence, the decision not to give up, that revealed the level of her faith. And this brings a deep reflection to you, because maybe at some point you felt that God was far away. Perhaps you prayed, waited, searched, and did not see answers in the time you wanted. And this generated doubt, fatigue, even the desire to stop. But what if this time is not rejection? What if it is exactly the scenario where your faith is being strengthened? Because the strongest faith is not born when everything happens fast. It is born when you continue without even seeing, when you choose to trust, even when silence tries to convince you otherwise, when you decide to stay, even without immediate guarantees. And it is in this kind of faith that the miracle becomes inevitable, not because you forced it, but because you stayed, not because everything was easy, but because you didn't give up. Maybe today you are in one of those moments where the answer has not yet arrived, where time seems longer than you expected. But that doesn't mean God isn't listening. It may mean that He is developing within you something that only delay can produce. And when that faith is established, it no longer depends on quick answers. It becomes firm, constant, unshakable. And it is exactly this kind of faith that sustains you until the right time comes. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, and this moment is not by chance. Continue to the end, because what is yet to be revealed may be just what was missing to strengthen your faith in a way you have never experienced before. And when you begin to understand this perseverance, a new key opens before your eyes. Spiritual life does not happen in a linear way. It happens in cycles. There are phases, seasons, specific moments that God establishes for each thing. And much of the frustration that many people feel comes precisely from not recognizing which station they are in. Because it is easy to rejoice in the harvest. It is easy to celebrate when the fruits appear, when the answers arrive, when everything begins to make sense. But before the harvest, there is planting. There is a time to prepare the land, to sow the seed, to take care of, to water, and above all, to wait. And the problem is that many people plant expecting to harvest the next day. He plants today and already wants results tomorrow. But God doesn't work like that. He respects the processes, respects the cycles, respects the time necessary for each thing to develop in the right way. In Galatians 6:9 it is written, "And let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due season we will reap." Realize that there is a promise, but there is also a set time. It's not just any time, it's not the time of haste, it's the right time. And maybe what's frustrating you isn't the lack of response, but the difficulty of accepting the station you're in. Because when you don't understand the cycle, you start comparing yourself. He looks at other people's lives and thinks that he is late, that he should be on another level, that something has gone wrong. But each person is in a different phase. Some are reaping what they have sown for years. Others are still planting. Others are being prepared to plant. And when you try to live someone's season without having gone through the process, it only generates anxiety and confusion. Maybe you're in a planting time right now, a time where you are doing what you can, you are seeking, you are making an effort, but you still don't see clear results. And this can give the feeling that nothing is happening. But in fact, it is exactly the opposite. Underground, where no one sees, the seed is developing. It is taking root, it is getting stronger, it is preparing to grow at the right time. And this process cannot be rushed, because if it is, it cannot be sustained. And so is God's timing in your life. There is something being generated right now, even if you can't see it yet. There is a growth happening in the invisible, a preparation that will sustain what will come after. And when you understand this, waiting stops being a burden and becomes part of the cycle. You begin to respect the process, to value each phase, to trust that, at the right time, what was planted will flourish. And most importantly, you stop comparing yourself. Because you understand that God is working in a unique way in your life, in your time, in your rhythm, in your process. If this message reached you and made sense for what you are living now, maybe it is because God is showing you that you are not late. You are exactly at the right station. And if you want to continue receiving this kind of direction and further strengthen your faith, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay connected with this word that can transform the way you see God's timing. And when you begin to understand God's cycles, an even greater challenge arises, standing firm when the season seems to completely contradict what God has promised. Because it is easy to trust when everything is favorable, when circumstances confirm it, when the signs point in the right direction. But true confidence reveals itself when the scenario does exactly the opposite. Daniel lived this intensely. He was faithful, upright, constant in his life with God. Even so, he was faced with an extreme situation where obeying God meant facing a death sentence. The lion's den was not only a danger, it was a direct contradiction to any expectation of protection. And yet, Daniel did not trade his faith. He did not change his stance. He did not adapt his conviction to avoid the problem. He remained the same, even though he knew the consequences. And that's exactly what reveals the level of your confidence. It was not a confidence based on external security, but on an internal certainty of who God was. In Daniel 6:23 it is written, "No mischief was found in him, because he had believed in his God." Notice that deliverance did not begin in the pit. It began in faith. It was confidence that sustained Daniel even before the miracle happened. And this connects directly with what many face today. Because there are times when everything around you seems otherwise. Situations that don't make sense, doors that close, challenges that arise just when you expected advancement. And in those moments, the mind begins to question, the heart tries to understand, and faith is put to the test. But this is exactly where trust in God's timing needs to take a stand. Not based on what you see, but on what you know. Not in circumstances, but in the conviction that God remains the same, regardless of the scenario. Maybe you're living something like that right now. A phase where what you expected did not happen, where the environment seems unfavorable, where everything seems to go in the opposite direction of the promise. And this can generate doubt. It can generate insecurity. It can even make you think that something has gotten out of control. But Daniel's story shows that even when everything seems otherwise, God remains in control. The grave was not the end. It was the scene where God's faithfulness was manifested in an incontestable way. And this reveals a profound truth. Trusting God is not expecting everything to be easy. It is remaining firm, even when it is not. It is continuing to believe, even when there are no clear signs. It is to maintain its position, even when it would be easier to retreat. Because true trust does not depend on favorable circumstances. It is born of a conviction that has been built over time. A certainty that God does not change, that He does not fail, that He continues to act even when you do not see. And it is this confidence that sustains you in the most difficult moments. Not as a passing emotion, but as a solid foundation that does not shake easily. And as long as you remain so, steadfast, even in the midst of the contrary, something is being strengthened within you in a way that no external situation could produce. And it is exactly at this point that many have not yet realized one of the greatest spiritual keys about God's time. Waiting is not an empty period. It can be one of the most active moments of your spiritual life. Because while everything seems to be still in the natural, there is a movement that can be activated in the invisible through prayer. Many people think that waiting on God just means waiting, enduring time, resisting until something happens. But the Bible shows something much deeper. It reveals that prayer not only sustains the heart during waiting, it participates directly in the fulfillment of God's plans. Elijah understood this powerfully. There was a time when the land was dry, with no rain, no sign of change. Naturally, everything indicated that nothing would happen anytime soon. But Elijah did not just observe the situation. He positioned himself in prayer. In James 5:17-18 it is written, Elijah was a man subject to the same passions as we are, and he prayed earnestly that it might not rain, and he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain. Notice this detail. He prayed again. This shows persistence, alignment, sensitivity to God's timing. Elijah did not pray once and gave up. He didn't base himself on what he saw, because at first there was no sign of rain. But he continued, insisted, remained, until that which was being generated in the spiritual manifested itself in the natural. And this completely changes the way you see waiting, because it ceases to be passive and becomes active. You are not just waiting for something to happen. You may be participating in this process through prayer. Perhaps, until now, you have waited in silence, with a tired heart, not knowing exactly what to do. But what if God is calling you to a deeper level? A place where you not only wait, but intercede, because prayer aligns you with God's timing. It adjusts your heart, strengthens your faith, and at the same time prepares the spiritual environment for what is going to happen. There is something being moved when you pray, even if your eyes cannot yet see. And the more you position yourself like this, the more you realize that you are not far from what God is doing. On the contrary, you are participating in it. There is a connection being strengthened, a sensitivity being developed, a faith being activated. Maybe the answer you're waiting for hasn't arrived yet, but that doesn't mean nothing is happening. It can mean that there is something being generated in the invisible. And your prayer is part of this process. And just like Elijah, maybe you need to stay a little longer. Pray one more time. Trust one more time. Not because God didn't hear it before, but because there is a perfect time where everything aligns. Few people will truly understand this. But if this message has reached you, there is something being awakened within your spirit. Stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can show you how to access even more deeply what God has already begun to do in your life. And as you begin to live this life of prayer, an even deeper revelation begins to form within you. Not everything God does is visible the moment it happens. In fact, many of the biggest wins have already been achieved before you even notice any changes around you. This is one of the greatest secrets about God's timing. He does not begin in the visible, he begins in the invisible. While your eyes still don't see, while circumstances haven't changed, while everything looks exactly the same, God is already working in a dimension that you can't see. Jehoshaphat's story shows this impressively. He received word that a large army was coming against him. Humanly speaking, there was no chance. It was a total disadvantage, a scenario where defeat seemed inevitable. But instead of despairing, Jehoshaphat sought God. And the answer that came was not a war strategy. It was not a human plan. It was a word that completely changed the perspective. In 2 Chronicles 20:17 it is written, "In this battle you will not have to fight. Stand still, stand up and see the salvation of the Lord." This seems illogical at first glance. How to win a battle without fighting? How to face an army without reacting? But God was revealing something greater. Victory was already being built before the confrontation even happened. And when the time came, what seemed impossible became reality. The enemies were defeated without Jehoshaphat having to lift a sword, because God had already acted before in the invisible, and that connects directly with what you might be living right now. Because perhaps, looking around you, everything still looks the same. Perhaps the situation has not yet changed, the answer has not yet arrived, the scenario still looks the same, and this can give the feeling that nothing is happening. But what if most of it has already been resolved, but has not yet manifested itself? Because God does not depend on visible time to act. He works in a dimension where things begin before they appear. And when you understand that, something changes inside you. Anxiety decreases, despair loses strength. because you begin to trust that even without seeing, God is already at work. Perhaps the answer you expect is already being prepared. Perhaps the solution is already in motion. Perhaps what seems impossible is now already being solved at a level that you cannot yet perceive. And that requires a different kind of faith. Not the faith that reacts to what it sees, but the faith that remains firm, even without evidence. A trust that does not depend on immediate signs, but on an inner certainty that God is already in control of everything. And as you stay like this, steadfast, trusting, something begins to align at the right time. Because what God does in the invisible is always manifested in the visible at the exact moment. And it is exactly here that many end up getting lost, because they let time weaken what God has said. They start trusting, they start believing, but as the days go by, as the years go by, that promise that was once alive begins to seem distant, almost forgotten. And the mind begins to question, is it still valid? Has the time not passed? Will God still fulfill? But there is one truth that needs to be engraved deep in your heart. Time has no authority to override what God has declared. What he says does not age, does not lose strength, does not expire. It remains alive, even when everything around it seems to say otherwise. Caleb lived this in a way that few can sustain. He received a promise when he was still young, when he had strength, willingness, when everything seemed close to happening. But time passed. Years turned into decades, situations have changed, scenarios have changed, generations have passed. And yet, the promise had not been fulfilled. Now imagine what could have happened inside him over that time. How many opportunities to give up, how many moments of doubt, how many times he could have thought that it no longer made sense to wait. But something inside him remained intact. And when the moment finally came, his posture reveals everything. In Joshua 14:12 it is written, "Now therefore give me this mountain of which the Lord spoke that day." He didn't ask for anything new. He did not look for an alternative. He took a stand based on what God had already said. That's powerful, because it shows that even after so long, the promise was still alive within him. It was not time that defined the value of the promise. It was God's faithfulness. And that speaks directly to you, because maybe there's something that God put in your heart long ago. Something you believed, something you kept, but that as the days passed began to seem too distant. Maybe you thought you missed the moment, that it no longer makes sense, that you are behind us. But what if it's still standing? Because God doesn't work with human deadlines. It works with perfect fulfillment. What he said is still valid, even if time has passed. The promise does not age, it matures. And when the right time comes, it manifests itself with a force that could only come from God. Perhaps what you are experiencing now is not the end of something, but the closest point to fulfillment. Perhaps everything that has happened so far has been preparation for this moment. And just like Caleb, you can stand up with confidence and say, this is what God said, and this is what still stands. If this message brought up something you thought you had already lost, but now realize that it is still alive inside you, write in the comments, I trust in God's action. Because to declare this is to align your faith with that which time has never been able to erase. And when you begin to understand that God's promises don't expire, an even deeper level of spiritual challenge arises, to keep obeying even when there's no visible sign that it makes sense. Because trusting in God's timing is not just believing that he will deliver, it is staying true to what he has asked for, even when everything around seems to contradict it. There is a dimension of faith where there is no applause, there is no recognition, there is no immediate confirmation. It is a silent place where there is only you, the word that God has given you, and the decision to continue. And it is exactly in this place that obedience becomes most powerful. Noah lived it in a way that defies any human logic. God gave him a completely unusual instruction: build an ark. There was no rain, there were no signs, there was no evidence that this would be necessary. Still, he started. Now imagine what this means in practice. Years of work, effort, dedication, without any external confirmation. Probably facing questions, looks of doubt, maybe even criticism. And yet, he kept going, day after day, without seeing results, without seeing a change in the scenario. In Genesis 6:22 it is written, "Thus did Noah, according to all that God commanded him, he did so." This phrase seems simple, but it carries enormous depth. He didn't do it partially, he didn't adapt, he didn't give up halfway. He just kept obeying. And this reveals something essential. Silent obedience is one of the greatest tests of trust in God's timing. Because it is easy to obey when there are signs, when there are results, when there is recognition. But when there is none of that, obedience becomes a pure choice based only on trust. Maybe you're experiencing something similar right now. Not necessarily building an ark, but sustaining decisions, maintaining positions, following directions that God has placed in your heart, even without seeing immediate results. And this can generate doubts. It can make you wonder if you're on the right track. But it is exactly in this type of scenario that faith is truly strengthened, because you learn not to depend on what you see. He learns not to base his decisions on circumstances. Learn to trust what God has said, above all logic. And when you remain like this, steadfast, constant, something powerful begins to be built within you. A faith that does not waver easily, a trust that does not depend on external confirmation, a spiritual strength that is sustained even in silence. God's timing reveals itself intensely in the lives of those who continue to walk, even when the scenario seems illogical. Because when the right moment comes, everything that was built in the invisible manifests itself in a way that no one can deny. And perhaps right now, you are in one of those silent processes, where it seems that nothing is happening, but in fact everything is being prepared, and your obedience, even without evidence, may be exactly what is aligning you with what God has already determined for the right time. And as this silent obedience shapes your faith, there is another element that begins to be dealt with in a profound way, often without you realizing it right away: the pride hidden within the heart. Because trusting in God's timing doesn't just require patience, it requires humility, and that's perhaps one of the hardest areas to align. This is because pride does not only manifest itself in visible attitudes, but also in subtle thoughts. In the expectation that God will do it your way, in the desire to control the process, in the difficulty of accepting simple paths when you expected something great. And it is exactly at this point that many get stuck without realizing it. Naaman lived this clearly. He was an important, respected man, commander of an army. He was accustomed to authority, recognition, and solutions compatible with his position. When he sought healing, he probably expected something equal to what he represented. Perhaps an extraordinary gesture, a public word, something grandiose. But God's answer was completely different. Simple, direct, even disconcerting for someone in his position. He was only to dive into the Jordan River, and at that moment it didn't make sense to him. It seemed too small, too simple, incompatible with her expectations. And this is where humility comes in, because before receiving healing, Naaman had to adjust his heart. He had to give up his own logic, his own way of thinking, his own expectation of how God should act. And only after that, he decided to comply. In 2 Kings 5:14 it is written, "And he went down and dipped in the Jordan 7 times, and he was cleansed." But before going down to the river, he had to go down inside himself. He had to strip himself of his position, his pride, his resistance. And this reveals something profound. Many answers are not being denied. They are being prepared. Time is not late. He's addressing areas that need to be aligned before the demonstration. Maybe you're expecting something specific, an answer, a change, a miracle. But what if before that God is working within you, adjusting expectations, breaking resistances, teaching you to trust in a simpler, purer, truer way? Because humility does not speed up God's time, but positions your heart to receive it. It makes room for you to accept the process, even when it doesn't make complete sense. It allows you to obey, even when the path looks different than you imagined. And when this humility is established, something changes profoundly. Anxiety decreases, resistance disappears, and the heart becomes more sensitive, more aligned, more prepared. Perhaps what is missing is not more effort, more attempt, more desperate search. Maybe it's just an internal adjustment, a decision to trust more simply, without demanding that everything happen your way. And just like Naaman, it may be that what you are looking for is closer than you think. But access passes through this place of surrender, humility, trust in the process. Because when the heart aligns, God's timing finds space to manifest itself in the right way, at the right time, the way He always planned. And after going through this process of humility, many are faced with a phase that is often misinterpreted, but which carries one of the most profound teachings about God's time: the desert. Because the desert is not comfortable, it is not easy, and it almost never makes sense while it is being lived. It seems empty, silent, even lonely, but in fact it is one of the greatest spiritual schools that one can go through. The people of Israel lived this intensely. They left Egypt with a clear promise before them, a destiny defined by God. But between the point of departure and the fulfillment of the promise, there was the desert. And that time was not just a geographical crossing, it was a necessary spiritual process. In Deuteronomy 8:2 it is written, "And you shall remember all the way by which the Lord your God led you in the wilderness." Realize that it was not a lost path, it was a guided path. God was present at every stage, even when the scenario seemed difficult. The desert teaches something that no other environment can teach with the same intensity: dependence. Because when everything is taken away, when resources are limited, when human solutions are not enough, you begin to realize that you need to trust God in a more real way. It also breaks self-sufficiency. That feeling that you can solve everything on your own begins to fall because the desert reveals limits. And this is not to weaken you, it is to align you. Because as long as there is overconfidence in oneself, it will be difficult to fully trust God. And at the same time, the desert reveals God's faithfulness in a unique way. Even in scarcity, there was provision. Even in uncertainty, there was direction. Even in difficulty, God did not fail to sustain. This creates a foundation of trust that does not depend on abundance, but on the certainty that God cares in any scenario. Maybe you're living in a kind of desert right now, a period where things seem more difficult, slower, quieter, where you don't see so many signs, where the answers don't come easily. And this can generate the feeling that you are distant, that something is not happening. But what if this time is, in fact, a training? Because the desert is not a place of abandonment, it is a place of preparation. It is where God works deep areas, adjusts motivations, strengthens the spirit, and teaches lessons that can only be learned there. And there's a purpose in all of this: to prepare you to live the promise without getting lost in it. Because there is no point in reaching the destination without having been transformed on the way. The desert guarantees that when you arrive, you will know how to value, you will know how to sustain, you will know how to stay. Maybe today you still don't see the end of this process, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have a clear purpose. Each day on this path is building something within you that will be essential later on. In the next few moments, something even deeper will connect with all of this that you are experiencing right now. Pay attention, because it may be just the sign you needed to understand what God is doing in your life. And after crossing this desert, learning to depend, being molded in silence, a principle emerges that few apply, but which has a profound power to accelerate what God has already begun. Gratitude before the answer, because most people only thank you after they see, after they receive, after everything is resolved. But there is a spiritual level where you give thanks first, and that is exactly what transforms everything. Gratitude at this level is not based on what has happened, but on who God is. It does not depend on evidence, it depends on trust. And that completely changes how you position yourself in the wait time. Because instead of complaining, questioning, or emotionally wearing yourself out, you begin to recognize that even without seeing, God is already at work. Jesus demonstrated this clearly in one of the most remarkable moments. In front of a hungry crowd, with few resources in their hands, the situation seemed limited. Humanly, there wasn't enough. But before any multiplication took place, he did something that reveals this principle. In John 6:11 it is written, "And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he broke them." Notice the order. First the gratitude, then the miracle. This reveals that gratitude is not a reaction to the miracle. It can be the environment where the miracle happens. Because when you give thanks before, you're declaring that you trust. He is saying, even without words, that he believes in God's action above what his eyes show. And that doesn't mean ignoring the pain, pretending everything is okay, or denying what you feel. True gratitude does not deny reality, it chooses to trust in spite of it. She recognizes that there is difficulty, but she also recognizes that God is still in control. Maybe you are in a moment where something is still missing, where there is still a need, a wait, an answer that has not arrived. And this can generate unrest, it can generate weariness. But what if, instead of focusing on what's missing, you started giving thanks for what God is already doing, even without seeing it completely? Because gratitude changes the spiritual environment. It takes the focus off scarcity and puts it on provision. It weakens anxiety and strengthens faith. It makes room for the heart to align with what God is preparing. And the more you practice this, the more you notice that something changes within you. There is more lightness, more peace, more trust. Not because everything has been resolved, but because you have chosen to trust before you see. And it is in this kind of positioning that God's timing manifests itself most powerfully. Because you're not just waiting, you're aligning. He's not just waiting, he's declaring confidence with his attitudes. Perhaps the miracle you are waiting for has not yet manifested itself in the visible. But when gratitude starts to be part of your path, you enter a level where the unseen starts to move more intensely. And what seemed distant begins to approach, not by force, but by alignment with God's perfect timing. And when you begin to live this gratitude before the answer, something even more essential needs to be sustained within you: perseverance. Because it's not enough to start well, it's not enough to believe for a while, it's not enough to trust while there's still courage. The true test of faith is to keep going when everything seems stagnant, when time goes on longer than expected. There is a point in the journey where many give up, not because they stopped believing completely, but because they got tired of waiting. And it is exactly at this point that perseverance becomes decisive. Because giving up in the middle of the process is not just stopping, it is giving up something that God was already building. Jesus taught this clearly in the parable of the persistent widow. She had no power, no influence, no resources. But there was something that made all the difference: insistence. She continued even without an immediate response, even without visible guarantees. And this posture revealed a profound spiritual principle. In Luke 18:7 it is written, "And shall not God avenge his elect, who cry out to him day and night?" This shows that there is value in continuity, in constancy, in the decision not to stop. Because perseverance keeps the flame of faith alive, even when time seems too long. Maybe you've felt this tiredness, that feeling that you've done everything you can, you've prayed, you've hoped, you've believed, and yet nothing has changed as you expected. And in those moments, the urge to give up starts to feel like an option. But that's exactly where the difference happens. Because those who trust in God's timing do not measure their faith only by the results, but by the decision to continue. Even tired, he continues. Even without seeing, he continues. Even without understanding everything, he continues. And this is not just about human effort, it's about a spiritual conviction that has been built along the way. A certainty that, if God began, he did not abandon it. If he promised, he did not forget. If he is leading, there is a purpose in each step. Perseverance is not just insisting for the sake of insisting, it is staying in line with what God has already spoken. It is keeping the heart steady, even when the mind tries to doubt. It is not allowing time to erase what God has ignited within you. And there's something powerful about it. The longer you stay, the more your faith gets stronger. Because every day you decide not to give up, you build a stronger foundation. And this foundation sustains you until the moment when everything begins to manifest. Maybe you're exactly at that point right now, between what God has spoken and what has not yet happened, between promise and silence. And that can be uncomfortable, it can be tiring, but it can also be the place where your faith is being strengthened like never before. Because those who come to fulfillment are not only those who believed in the beginning, they are those who stayed until the end. And as you continue, even without complete answers, something inside you is being grounded in a way that nothing can shake later. And it is exactly when this perseverance holds firm that something even deeper begins to envelop the heart. A peace that makes no sense to human logic. Because by now you have already understood about waiting, trusting, persevering, obeying. But there is a level where even without answers, something inside you begins to rest, and that peace doesn't come from settled circumstances. It does not depend on seeing everything in place, nor on understanding all the details. It arises even when there are still questions, even when the scenario has not yet changed completely. And that's what makes this peace so different. The Apostle Paul described this reality very clearly in Philippians 4:7, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts. That means it's not a logical peace. It's not something that can be explained easily. It is a peace that goes beyond reason, that goes beyond what you could produce on your own. Maybe you've experienced this at some point. A difficult situation, an uncertain scenario, but at the same time, an unexpected calm. As if, even without answers, something inside you says that everything is under control. This is not natural. This is spiritual. Because when you begin to trust God's timing more deeply, He doesn't just work around you, He begins to guard your inside. It protects your mind against anxiety, calms your thoughts, reduces that constant cycle of worry that you try to master. And this completely changes the way you live the weight. Because before, each day could seem heavy, full of doubts, loaded with tension. But now, even if there are still uncertainties, there is a different stability, a feeling that you no longer have to fight everything alone. This peace works as a protection. It guards the heart against discouragement, prevents anxiety from taking over, blocks the fear that tries to grow when responses are delayed. And that doesn't mean that the challenges have disappeared, but it does mean that you no longer react in the same way. Maybe you're still waiting for something important. Maybe there's still an area of your life that seems undefined. But at the same time, something inside you is no longer as agitated as it once was. There is a calmness, a quiet trust, a sense that God is taking care of you, even if you don't see all the details. And this is one of the greatest evidences that God's timing is active in your life. Because even before He changes the scenery, He changes you. Before delivering the answer, He delivers peace. Before He resolves everything around, He stabilizes what is inside. And when this peace is established, you begin to realize that you no longer have to live under pressure for time. You no longer need to run against something that is already in God's hands. There is a rest that allows you to continue, even without having all the answers. And maybe that's exactly what God is releasing upon you right now. Not just future answers, but a present rest. A peace that sustains, that strengthens, that keeps you firm while everything is still being built. At the end of this path, something even deeper will be revealed, something that can completely transform the way you live each phase of your journey. Stay until the end, because you can experience this presence of God in a way that goes beyond words. And when this peace finally settles within you, something extraordinary begins to happen. You come to understand that God's timing not only sustains, it is fulfilled with absolute perfection. There is no delay, there is no error, there is no failure. There is an exact point where everything fits together so precisely that no human explanation can fully reach. Because so far you have seen processes, waits, silences, internal adjustments. But there is a moment when everything that seemed disconnected begins to make sense. Situations that once seemed confusing are aligned, paths that were closed open up, answers that took a long time arrive with a clarity that only God could build. The greatest example of this is in the very birth of Jesus. For generations, promises have been released. Prophets announced, the people waited, time passed, and from the outside it might seem like it was taking too long. But the Bible reveals something that completely changes this perspective. In Galatians 4:4, it is written, "But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth His Son." This means that it was not before, it was not after, it was exactly at the right time. Not a second early, not a second late. And this reveals a truth that transforms the way you see your own life. God does not work with improvisation. Everything He does is within a perfect time, where every detail has already been considered, where every connection has already been prepared, where every step has a definite purpose. Perhaps during the process, you felt that you were taking too long. Maybe you questioned it, maybe you thought it could happen faster, but when God's timing is fulfilled, you realize that if it had happened before, you wouldn't be ready. If it had been later, it would not have been the ideal time. There is a precision in God's action that goes beyond our comprehension. He not only fulfills what He promises, He fulfills it in the best possible way, in the most aligned scenario, at the most appropriate time. And when that happens, there is no doubt. There is no room for questioning. It is clear that it was God. Because everything fits together in a way that no human effort could produce. Maybe you're still halfway there, still waiting, still not seeing the full fit. But that doesn't mean He's not being prepared. It means that the fullness of time has not yet come. And when it arrives, you won't need to force anything. You won't have to chase desperately. Things will flow, connections will happen, answers will emerge. Because what comes from God at the right time bears an unmistakable mark: peace, clarity, and completeness. And perhaps, right now, you are closer to that moment than you think. Everything you have lived so far may be aligning you to that exact point where God will manifest what He has already determined. Nothing in this life happens without a purpose. If that word has found you in a different way, as if it was speaking directly to your heart, perhaps it is a sign that something is aligning. If you feel this, write in the comments, "I believe, Lord." Because recognizing this time is the first step to living what God has already prepared. And after all that has been revealed so far, one truth begins to become impossible to ignore. When you understand that God's timing is perfect, the next step is not to try to control. It is to learn to surrender. Because it's no longer about looking for quick answers, but about trusting deeply in the person who's driving every detail, even when you don't see the full picture yet. God's word reminds us in Psalm 37:5, "Commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will do it." This is not just an orientation, it is a direct invitation to rest. A call to let go of what you tried to carry alone and allow God to take control of the time, the answers, and the paths. Now, this is the time to silence the heart and draw closer. To put aside the rush, the doubts, and the weight of waiting, and simply make room for God to act, not with resistance, but with surrender. Not with fear, but with confidence. Let's pray together, placing before God everything that still seems uncertain, trusting that He is already working in every detail, in perfect timing. Beloved Father, your word teaches us that those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength, and it is with this truth that we now stand before your presence, recognizing that your timing is perfect, even when our hearts are still trying to understand. Lord, we thank you for all that has been revealed so far, for every teaching, for every direction, for every word that has strengthened our faith and opened our eyes to understand that you have never been absent, but always working in silence, aligning every detail of our life. We ask you now, Father, to give us the strength to continue, the wisdom to discern your actions, and the faith to stand firm even when there are no visible signs. Teach us to trust in your timing, to rest in your will, and not to be carried away by anxiety or fear. May our hearts be aligned with yours, may our minds be grounded in your promises, and may our lives reflect that trust that comes from above. Lord, look at every person who is living a time of waiting, at those who are tired, afflicted, without answers, facing emotional, spiritual, and even financial struggles. It brings healing to those who are wounded, restoration to homes in need of peace, provision for those who are struggling, and direction to those who do not know which way to go. May your power reach every area. May your care be manifested in a real way, and may your love envelop every heart now. At this moment in silence, each one presents to you what no one else sees, what is kept in the depths of the soul, the pains, the fears, the dreams, and the deepest needs. Receive, Lord, every prayer, every cry, every tear that has been shed in secret. Father, we commend everything into your hands. We surrender our time, our plans, our expectations, and learn to trust that the Lord knows exactly what He is doing. May your will prevail, may your purpose be fulfilled, and may we live each stage with faith and obedience, knowing that the best always comes from you. May your peace, which passeth all understanding, guard our hearts and minds, bringing rest even in the midst of waiting. Strengthen us to continue, sustain us with your presence, and prepare us for the moment when everything will be fulfilled according to your will. We pray, trusting, resting, and surrendering everything. In Jesus' name, amen. Trusting in God's timing is a decision that completely transforms the way we live because it changes the outlook, strengthens the heart, and brings a rest that the world cannot offer. What once seemed like delay is now understood as preparation. What seemed like silence reveals itself as care, and what seemed distant begins to make sense within a larger plan. God has never stood still, has never been absent, and has never lost control. He has always been working behind the scenes, aligning people, situations, and details that only make sense at the right time. Each phase of this journey showed that God's timing does not fail, does not advance, and is not late. It happens with precision, with purpose, and with perfection. And now, with this understanding, the heart no longer needs to live in anxiety, because there is a greater certainty sustaining everything. God is in control. Each wait has value, each process has meaning, and each promise lives on until the day it will be fulfilled. And that's exactly what changes everything. Because when you learn to trust in God's timing, you stop fighting against time and start walking with Him. He stops living under pressure and starts living aligned. And on this journey, even before you see all the answers, you already experience something powerful: peace, confidence, and the certainty that the best is yet to come. After everything you've heard so far, one truth needs to be engraved in your heart. Trusting in God's timing isn't just waiting, it's living differently every day, even when nothing seems to change. This message is for you, and not by chance, because God chose you to hear this today and awaken something that might have been dormant within you. Each teaching revealed that time is not your enemy, but an instrument in God's hands, molding, aligning, and preparing everything to perfection. Now, the question that remains is simple and profound at the same time. Are you willing to live this truth in practice, even when you don't fully understand what God is doing? I'm truly happy to know that we are walking together on this journey of faith, because you are part of it in a unique way. First of all, feel embraced by this message and by everything we are building here. If this content touched your heart, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to continue receiving these words. But I also want to hear from you. I want to know about you. Comment below where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you are experiencing, because your story matters, and together we can form a chain of faith and prayer that reaches lives. And it doesn't end here, because what you saw today is just a part of something much bigger. In the next video, we'll go even deeper, revealing how to live daily in alignment with God's presence and how to notice signs that many ignore. There is a next step in this journey, and it can open your eyes to something you never noticed before, something that can completely transform the way you see your spiritual life and God's action in every detail. As you follow this journey, remember that each step of faith is already an advance in the spiritual world, even if your eyes cannot yet perceive it. What seems simple today may be just what God is using to build something extraordinary tomorrow. Do not underestimate ordinary days, nor silent moments, because it is in them that heaven works the most. Keep steadfast, keep trusting, keep moving forward, because God's timing never fails, and what He started in you will be brought to perfect fulfillment at the right time, in the right way, and with eternal purpose. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater than any attack. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and I'll wait for you in the next video.